They were no longer watched. No guards shouted. No orders were given. Yet every morning, the men lined up at the same time, walked the same paths, and followed rules no one enforced anymore. No one told them to do it. And that was the moment they realized something was still The gates were open now, and the watchtowers stood empty, their platforms silent against the pale morning sky, while the fences remained where they had always been, unchanged in shape yet stripped of purpose. Guards no longer paced the perimeter with rifles resting on their shoulders, and no whistles echoed across the yard. Yet every morning inside the camp still began in exactly the same way, as if nothing essential had truly changed. Before any sound carried across the open space between the barracks, and before sunlight fully reached the weathered wooden walls, men stirred from their bunks at nearly the same moment. Not because an order had been given or a signal had been heard, but because their bodies responded automatically, guided by habits formed under months of repetition. There was no urgency in their movements, no panic or confusion, only a quiet certainty that carried them forward, as though an invisible schedule still governed the hour. Boots were laced carefully, fingers moving with practiced efficiency, while shirts were buttoned without haste, each motion deliberate and familiar. Beds were folded and straightened with the same careful precision learned long before the gates were unlocked, and no one stopped to question why the routine continued, even though no punishment waited for those who chose to remain still. The discipline no longer belonged to the camp. It lived within the men themselves. Outside, the yard remained silent, marked only by the faint sounds of footsteps on packed earth and the distant creak of aging wood. There were no shouted commands, no inspections, and no visible authority enforcing order. Yet lines formed naturally, spacing maintained by instinct rather than instruction. Men stood where they had always stood, facing the same directions, their eyes fixed ahead as if expecting something that never came. The camp schedule had dissolved on paper, erased by decisions made far beyond the fences, but it survived intact in memory and muscle, shaping behavior long after its official end. Time inside the camp no longer needed to be announced, because it was already understood, measured not by clocks or bells, but by deeply embedded rhythm. Morning was not a choice. It was a condition the body obeyed without question. Some men noticed the absence of control and felt a brief flicker of awareness, a momentary recognition that they were no longer being watched, no longer required to follow the same rigid pattern. Yet even those who sensed it found themselves unable to act on that knowledge. Standing still felt wrong, as though stillness itself was a violation. And so they moved, not out of fear, but out of habit reinforced over countless identical mornings. The barracks, once symbols of confinement, now felt strangely neutral, neither threatening nor comforting, simply present. The fences still cast long shadows across the ground, but those shadows no longer marked boundaries enforced by force. Instead, they traced lines of memory, reminders of a structure that had shaped daily life so completely that its removal left behind an unexpected emptiness. Freedom, when it arrived, did not announce itself with relief or celebration. It came quietly, almost unnoticed, slipping into the camp without ceremony, leaving the men to confront a question none of them had prepared for. If the rules were gone, why did everything still feel the same? For many, the answer lay not in the fences or the guards, but in the realization that captivity had extended beyond the physical boundaries of the camp. The routines, the order, and the discipline had been absorbed so deeply that they continued to dictate behavior even in the absence of enforcement. The camp no longer needed to function as a prison, because its structure had already been internalized. As the morning wore on, nothing happened, and yet everything continued, unchanged in appearance, but altered in meaning. The men waited, not because they were told to, but because waiting had become the safest and most familiar state. In the quiet of that open yard, it became clear that leaving the camp would not simply require walking through an open gate, but undoing something far more difficult, something that had taken root long before freedom was offered. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the day unfolded, the camp remained suspended in a strange state of stillness, neither active nor abandoned, as if time itself had slowed to observe what would happen next. The men did not disperse when the morning routine ended, nor did they rush toward the open gates, even though nothing physically prevented them from leaving. Instead, they lingered in familiar places, drifting toward the same benches, the same shaded corners, and the same stretches of open ground they had occupied countless times before. Waiting had once been imposed from the outside, enforced by rules and reinforced by consequence. But now it continued without instruction, guided by an internal sense that action required permission, even when none was needed. Minutes passed quietly, then hours, marked only by the shifting angle of sunlight across the yard and the gradual warming of the air. No one announced the passage of time, yet everyone felt it, heavy and unspoken. Some men sat with their backs against the barracks walls, staring ahead without clear focus, while others paced slowly along paths worn into the ground by years of repetitive movement. Conversations were rare and subdued, not because speech was forbidden, but because silence had become the default language of the camp. Words felt unnecessary, even intrusive, in a place where listening and observing had long mattered more than speaking. Meals, when they came, followed the same quiet order as always. Men approached the distribution area without being called, forming loose lines that required no correction. Hands reached forward automatically, receiving portions without comment or complaint, and then retreating to familiar spots to eat. The food itself had not changed, but the act of eating felt strangely disconnected from hunger, more like a task to be completed than a response to need. Even laughter, when it appeared, sounded cautious and brief, quickly fading as though it had crossed an invisible boundary. Smiles were fleeting, restrained by a lingering sense that too much expression might invite attention, even though there was no one left to enforce restraint. The habits of self-control, once essential for survival, now persisted without purpose, shaping behavior long after their necessity had passed. Throughout the afternoon, the open gate remained visible from nearly every point in the yard, a constant presence that drew occasional glances but inspired little movement. For some, it felt less like an exit and more like an unfamiliar object, something real but difficult to interpret. Leaving required a decision, and decisions have been rare inside the camp, replaced instead by compliance and routine. A few men approached the gate slowly, stopping just short of it, standing as if waiting for confirmation that never arrived. They looked beyond the fence toward the open land outside, where roads stretched away into uncertainty, offering no clear direction or promise. Turning back felt easier than stepping forward, and so many did exactly that, retreating to the safety of the known rather than risk the confusion of freedom. The absence of authority created a vacuum that no one knew how to fill. Without orders, the men were left alone with their own thoughts, and for some, that proved more unsettling than captivity itself. Structure had once provided clarity, even if it came at the cost of freedom. Now, with structure gone, choice felt heavy, demanding a kind of responsibility they had not carried for a long time. As evening approached, the camp did not change its rhythm. There was no signal to mark the end of the day, yet men began returning to the barracks, settling back into their bunks as naturally as they had risen that morning. The doors remained open, and the yard stayed quiet, but the pattern repeated itself, uninterrupted. In that repetition, a deeper truth became apparent. The camp no longer needed walls or guards to hold the men in place, because the routines of captivity had reshaped their sense of time, movement, and purpose. Waiting had become more than an activity. It had become a way of existing, filling the space where choice should have been, and delaying a future that felt increasingly distant. Over time, the sense of waiting that had filled the camp began to change its shape, no longer tied to specific moments or routines, but spreading quietly into the way the men understood themselves. Days passed without distinction, blending together until memory struggled to separate one from another. The past felt distant and indistinct, while the future remained undefined, suspended somewhere beyond the fences that no longer mattered. Names, once spoken daily in roll calls and documents, slowly lost their weight. Men referred to one another less by identity and more by position or proximity. The man on the upper bunk, the one who always sat near the door, the one who paced at dusk. Individual histories, once fiercely protected, became unnecessary to share, as if recalling them required an effort no longer worth making. Personal belongings remained few and unchanged. The same worn jacket, the same boots, the same small items tucked away without intention. These objects no longer represented who someone had been, but simply what remained. Even mirrors, when encountered, offered little recognition. Faces appeared thinner, expressions flatter, shaped by long habits of restraint and observation rather than emotion. Inside the barracks, conversations that did occur often circled around practical details rather than meaning. Time was discussed only in vague terms, measured by meals or light rather than dates or plans. Questions about home, family, or life beyond the camp surfaced less frequently, not because they were forbidden, but because imagining those things felt increasingly abstract, almost fictional. The absence of external pressure did not restore individuality as expected. Instead, it revealed how deeply the structure of captivity had reorganized the inner world of the men. Choices once limited had now become overwhelming. Without clear boundaries, the idea of deciding who to be or what to want felt unfamiliar, even exhausting. Some men attempted small acts of differentiation, adjusting their routines slightly, choosing different paths across the yard, or sitting in new places, but these efforts often faded quickly. The comfort of sameness proved stronger than the uncertainty of change. Blending in felt safer than standing apart, even when standing apart carried no visible risk. Letters, when they arrived, were handled with care, but rarely read more than once. Words from the outside described lives that continued without reference to the camp, places that had evolved, people who had adapted. Instead of comfort, these messages sometimes produced a quiet distance, reinforcing the sense that the men no longer fully belonged to the world they had left behind. As nights settled, the camp grew quiet in ways that felt deeper than silence. Thoughts slowed, drifting without urgency or direction. Sleep came easily, not from peace, but from exhaustion born of monotony. Dreams, when they occurred, were often fragmented, lacking clear settings or faces, reflecting an inner landscape that had become as undefined as the days themselves. What emerged during this period was not despair, but a subtler erosion. Identity did not collapse suddenly. It softened, losing its edges, becoming less specific with each passing day. The men were still present, still breathing, still moving through familiar motions, but the sense of being someone distinct began to thin, replaced by a quieter existence shaped almost entirely by the environment around them. In this state, the camp no longer functioned as a place of confinement. It had become a framework through which life was interpreted, setting the limits not of movement, but of imagination. And as those limits settled deeper inside, the possibility of reclaiming a former self grew increasingly distant, not because it was impossible, but because it no longer felt necessary. As the weeks continued without clear direction, a subtle shift took place inside the camp, one that did not announce itself through orders or changes in routine, but emerged quietly through behavior. With fewer guards present and fewer instructions given, the responsibility for maintaining order began to move inward, settling among the men themselves. At first, this self-regulation appeared practical rather than intentional. Someone reminded another to keep the bunks aligned, to avoid clutter near the walkways, to remain quiet during certain hours. These reminders carried no authority, yet they were followed without resistance. What had once been enforced from the outside now persisted through shared expectation. Gradually, patterns solidified. Certain men assumed informal roles, not by appointment, but through repetition. One always woke early and began cleaning. Another ensured tools were returned to their places. A third observed quietly, stepping in only when something felt out of alignment. None of these roles were discussed openly, yet they were understood by everyone. Discomfort arose not from punishment, but from deviation. When someone disrupted the familiar rhythm, even unintentionally, the reaction was immediate but restrained. A glance, a pause in conversation, a silence that communicated disapproval without words. Correction no longer required instruction. It emerged naturally from a group. This internal discipline carried an odd sense of stability. In a world without clear external control, these self-imposed structures offered predictability. The men did not question why they continued to behave as prisoners when they were no longer closely monitored. The habits had become embedded, functioning independently of their original purpose. Freedom, in this context, felt abstract. The gates might have remained open, but the boundaries had shifted inward. Movement was technically unrestricted, yet few ventured far beyond familiar paths. The idea of leaving the yard or altering daily routines significantly felt unnecessary and even uncomfortable. Conversations reflected this change. Discussion of rules no longer focused on what was permitted or forbidden, but on what was expected. Expectations replaced commands, and expectations prove harder to challenge. They carried the weight of collective agreement rather than imposed authority. Over time, the presence of guards became almost irrelevant. Their absence did not signal opportunity, but rather confirmed that the system was functioning without them. The camp no longer needed supervision to exist as a controlled environment. It had been internalized. This realization did not arrive as a moment of clarity. Instead, it settled slowly, becoming apparent only through repetition. Days passed smoothly, efficiently, without incident, reinforcing the idea that order was being maintained successfully. Yet beneath this surface calm, something essential was narrowing. The men were no longer responding to captivity as a temporary condition. They were maintaining it as a way of life. Choices were filtered through what felt acceptable rather than what was possible. Behavior aligned with habit rather than intention. As night fell, the quiet felt heavier than before, not because of fear or uncertainty, but because nothing demanded change. The absence of conflict created a sense of completion, as if the system had reached its final form. The camp no longer constrained the men through force or threat. It existed through compliance, sustained quietly by those within it. In this phase, captivity no longer depended on walls, fences, or guards. It depended on memory, routine, and the comfort of familiarity. And as these elements settled deeper into daily life, the distinction between confinement and normalcy grew increasingly difficult to identify. As the camp settled into this new, self-sustaining order, the men began to experience a strange sense of ease that did not resemble freedom, but did not feel like captivity either. Life moved forward smoothly, without interruption or conflict, guided by expectations that required no explanation. Days unfolded predictably, shaped by routines that had survived the disappearance of authority. This predictability offered relief. In a world stripped of clear direction, familiarity became a form of safety. The men no longer had to decide what came next, because the pattern of the day had already been established through repetition. Obedience no longer felt imposed. It felt practical, even comforting, as if it removed the burden of uncertainty that choice inevitably brought. The absence of resistance did not signal contentment, but adaptation. The men were not unaware of their condition, yet awareness no longer produced urgency. Questioning the structure required effort, and effort felt unnecessary in a system that functioned without disruption. Compliance, once a survival tactic, had evolved into a preferred state of being. Individual impulses softened further during this phase. Differences in behavior became less noticeable, not because they were suppressed forcefully, but because blending in reduced friction. Standing out offered no advantage, while conformity ensured stability. Over time, this balance reinforced itself, as each day that passed without incident validated the system as it existed. The camp, once defined by constraint, now offered something resembling normalcy. Meals arrived on time. Work, when assigned, proceeded without confusion. Rest followed naturally. The men learned to move through these cycles without resistance, conserving energy and avoiding emotional disturbance. Life became manageable again, though narrower than before. What disappeared gradually was the impulse to imagine alternatives. The idea of leaving, once charged with anticipation, lost its urgency. The open gate remained visible, yet it no longer represented possibility. It had become part of the background, an object without meaning, overshadowed by the quiet efficiency of daily life inside the camp. In this environment, obedience ceased to feel like submission. It became routine, woven into identity rather than behavior alone. The men did not think of themselves as controlled. They thought of themselves as settled. Stability, however limited, felt preferable to the uncertainty beyond the familiar boundaries of the yard. Even moments of reflection failed to disrupt this equilibrium. Thoughts about the future surfaced occasionally, but they lacked momentum, drifting away without prompting action. The present, structured and predictable, demanded nothing more than participation. And participation required no belief, only continuation. As weeks passed, the system sustained itself effortlessly. The men corrected one another gently, reinforced expectations subtly, and maintained order without instruction. Authority had been replaced by habit, and habit proved more resilient than force ever had. This was not a victory for the camp, nor a defeat for the men. It was the outcome of prolonged adaptation, the final stage of a process that had begun with survival and ended with internalized control. The camp no longer needed to enforce obedience because obedience had become indistinguishable from comfort. And so life continued quietly and efficiently within boundaries that no longer required walls. The men remained present, active, and functional, yet something essential had narrowed, settling into a form that felt complete enough to resist change. In this state, captivity had reached its most durable expression. not through fear or punishment, but through the calm acceptance of a system that asked nothing and promised nothing in return. By the time the camp reached this quiet balance, nothing appeared broken from the outside, because order remained, routines functioned, and life continued without disruption. The fences still stood, but they no longer mattered in the way they once had, and the guards, whether present or absent, were no longer essential to maintaining control. What endured was not fear, but habit, shaped slowly through repetition and reinforced by the comfort of predictability. The men did not remain because they were forced to, but because leaving required a kind of uncertainty they had learned to avoid. Obedience had become internal, woven into daily life, so completely that it no longer felt like obedience at all. In this final stage, captivity no longer depended on punishment or threat. It survived through familiarity, through the quiet relief of knowing what to expect, and through the absence of questions that once demanded answers. The camp had completed its work not by holding the men inside, but by teaching them how to remain. And so the gates could stay open, the watchtowers could remain empty, and the rules could fade into memory, because the structure that mattered most no longer needed to be enforced. It existed within the men themselves, steady and unchallenged, long after the camp had ceased to function as a prison in any visible sense. In the silence that followed, it became clear that the most enduring form of captivity was not built with fences or walls, but with habits that learned how to survive without them. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.